Heidi-ho, Reject Nation. I'm Greg Alba.
And I'm John Humphrey.
We watched Hellboy 2019. I read Hellboy: The Wild Hunt very, very recently. I know this movie is primarily inspired by, I think, 3 specific Hellboy stories from Mike Mignola.
Yeah, there's like a 3-book arc for Nimue.
I think I read the middle one. It was cool watching this movie because there were scenes, for sure, in terms of like designs, the aesthetic, that were just straight up ripped from the comics. But then there's also just dialogue and just full-on scenes that are like, oh, that's exactly what I read last week. For me, that was like, yeah, it was pretty cool to see brought to life.
And if you're a big fan of the comics, I mean, that's going to be gratifying either way.
I do have a slight bias, with a very, very slight bias that I feel like I should just acknowledge, because some people have already heard me talk about him before. I know the man Joe Harlow. He's the guy who did the new makeup for Hellboy, like not just Hellboy himself, the special character design, but also all the practical effects involved in this film. Having some inside knowledge into the movie, I feel like I was more properly prepped for this film than a lot of other people. I knew way well going into this movie that it was going to be a throwback to 80s monster horror flicks, kind of that B-movie grindhouse-esque style infused in this film. And knowing some of Neil Marshall's past films, every time I hear the name Neil Marshall, they always talk about those Game of Thrones episodes he's directed. But he's done stuff like Dog Soldiers, The Descent. He knows how to have like a lot of good, fun, gory horror movies,
Doomsday.
Yeah, Doomsday, stuff like that. So I wasn't surprised or taken aback by the kind of film that we got. I know on Rotten Tomatoes right now, the critic score is not exceptionally high. It's pretty low. But I know the audience score is certified fresh right now, which is a cool sign. My personal experience of this film is I think there's a lot of pros and there's a lot of cons. And funny enough, I did hear some Suicide Squad comparisons to this movie prior to watching it. And watching this movie, I could see why in terms of like editing, music, pacing, how much story is involved. But I kind of had a opposite response. Whereas Suicide Squad, I saw all those flaws, and I was like, it's still a fun movie. And then the more I thought about it, the more I really didn't like that movie. It was one of those films. And Hellboy was like on the opposite spectrum for me. I walked out and I was thinking a lot about the flaws that I had with the film this morning, especially when I was thinking about it last night. And then this morning, I slept over at my girlfriend Olivia's place and I came back here. And one of the first things I told John was, that Hellboy movie is really growing on me a hell of a lot. I find that there's a lot of things I really did enjoy about this movie. So I want to talk about those elements first, and then we'll go into the cons. It's like I actually told Joe, I'm like, it's one of those things where like for every con there's a pro, and for every pro there's kind of a con too. A mixed bag, but I'm finding that the pros for me are really outweighing the cons that I had for the film.
I had a similar experience to you with the Suicide Squad comparison of, coming out of Suicide Squad, I was like, oh, that's fun, but then it deteriorated very fast in my mind. And I think part of that is because Suicide Squad, when you think about just the construction of the plot, it's like you realize that there's some nonsense in there that wouldn't have worked anyway, at least in the form that the story has taken. Whereas in this movie, if you smooth some things out, the story itself still works. And I think that's the key.
For starters, David Harbour as Hellboy, I thought did a really, really good job. You can really differentiate the differences between Ron Perlman's interpretation and David Harbour's interpretation. Because David Harbour brings this level of childlike insecurity, kind of like a boy who's been hurt sort of quality underneath,
like an adolescent or like a teenager with some angst to work out. He's got issues with his dad and stuff like that.
Which is a running theme in the movie.
Yeah, and he's just at odds with his position in the world as well as his position, hunting down paranormal creatures and stuff.
I'm very much relieved to be in the situation where a lot of my issues that we'll go into come down to, editing, pacing, and some CGI, which is not really that great in certain sequences, right? So if I knew any of those guys, then I would be like, maybe we shouldn't just shoot a review. Fortunately, the guy who did all the practical effects in this movie are amazing.
Pretty great.
And that seems to be all around the map in terms of even a lot of people who are not recommending this movie. A lot of people are still going, but the practical effects in here and the makeup are still really damn good in the movie. And it sure does shine. It's one of the highlights of the movie, like David Harbour's performance and the makeup. And they kind of have to, especially with the Hellboy design, that has to work together really well. I know there was some backlash with the first trailer in terms of how people were responding to the makeup, but when you watch the movie, you forget about like, oh, it's David Harbour underneath all that. You quickly buy into it and it feels very lived in, as well as all the other designs as well. So those are like the two main highlights. Also, if you're a person who heard this movie's, oh, it's R-rated, I hear it's going to be more violent. Yeah, it fucking delivers on that. It is very, very violent, sometimes shockingly violent. There are certain moments where especially towards the finale, I won't give it away, but there are moments towards the finale where my jaw was dropped. They went there. This feels like I'm watching Attack on Titan right now. Yeah, this is so gory.
Some like hellish Silent Hill style gore.
Yes. Oh yeah. So it really if you want that element of B-movie monster mayhem, violence, gore, you're gonna get that. You get a good lead, you do get a good lead, and the designs on this really cool. And I feel like with a lot of big budget comic book adaptations, it's primarily CGI reliant. It was cool that the practical effects in here and the makeup are all really well done. Even though I've only read 1/3 of the main books that this is based off of, it was really cool to see how much of that was just directly ripped and brought to the big screen. So I think for fans of the Hellboy comics, I can't speak in terms of the whole thing, but from what I can gather, it feels pretty accurate, and this is why I think Mike Mignola was, backing this movie so much.
I don't think either of us is like madly attached to the Del Toro versions, and so in that way, this one is allowed to have its own aesthetic, which, is going to have some reminiscent quality because Hellboy is in it, but yeah, the tone and what the movie's going for is so different.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is tied in more directly to the source material. In terms of just like a splattery action flick, I think there is a lot to enjoy here because that's mainly the flavor I got. Fantasy action with a lot of gore in it. I didn't necessarily feel tense. I didn't really feel like this was a horror movie.
No.
Which I arguably could have maybe used a bit more of, but yeah, generally speaking, in terms of an action movie especially, I feel like that's where this movie delivers the most.
It feels more Army of Darkness, less Evil Dead. Funny enough, Army of Darkness was not well received when it first came out, and I feel like this could have a similar thing over time as well. I'm not so biased to the point that I did not have issues with the way a lot of this was actually executed. My main issue, if I were to boil down everything I'm about to talk about, falls under this one line, which is I could totally tell there was a longer movie here. I could feel some reshoots, and I could feel they really had to trim it down, which is a similar issue that people felt with Suicide Squad. Yeah. And that was something that definitely would come up in my brain a good amount of time when I was watching this movie. Was I didn't think this movie was necessarily well edited. I didn't think it was necessarily well paced. For every pro, there's a con. For every con, there's a pro. Because sometimes in that messiness, it makes it more fun. Sometimes it just really detracts,
Yeah, I mean, there are just a lot of edges on this movie for me. And yeah, there are times when it just gets mired with choppy editing and choppy sound cues that just kind of call attention to the fact.
Yeah, some weird ADR.
Yeah. There are a lot of lines that are kind of thrown out there, and covered in coverage and stuff like that. And after a certain point, there are times where I personally was just really reminded I'm watching a movie right now, and I'm kind of aware that this is all a set. So some of those things do break the illusion. However, I do think that there are sequences in this movie and moments in this movie, vignettes at least, that do translate. I was kind of in and out of the movie a lot. But there are times where I was absorbed in it and I was laughing, or I was, excited for some kind of action set piece. And I mean, another Suicide Squad parallel is this movie is crammed full of popular music. Half the time it's there's 20 seconds of some loud metal song, and that'll be the transition for everything.
Yeah, sometimes it works, and sometimes it undercuts a lot of what could be a real tense scene or a real a scene where you're just pulled in by the emotional gravitas. There are times where it really just undercuts the effect the scene could actually have, and I feel like sometimes the soundtracks that are used are meant to smooth out some of that choppy editing, but instead it kind of just draws attention.
It's kind of a drawback to the teenage heavy metal vibe. It's half the time it works, and half the time you're like, oh, maybe just turn it a little down.
Yeah,
maybe
it's a pretty loud movie. Yeah,
maybe get a score piece going in here.
I think too that some complaints I've heard is that's overstuffed, and there are times where I did feel there's too many plot lines in here. The con, there's so many plot lines in here. The pro, in that mess, what I found myself weirdly feeling when I woke up, it's kind of cool that you kind of sort of got this wide variety collection of all different kinds of creatures and storylines sort of shoved in here, because this script is heavily exposition expositional. It's a very, very expositional script, very plot heavy. But like I said, when I read The Wild Hunt, I'm like, that's pretty much how The Wild Hunt is. That's the weird thing. And sometimes directly adapting a comic straight from the pages does not necessarily mean it translates well to the screen, because it could just communicate as being overly expositional and stuff. So that's why my brain is like half criticism, half forgiving, because I'm like, yeah, when I read the comic, I was like, yeah, that's pretty much the comic is very expositional.
Yeah, that's where the debate about comic book accuracy does enter into my mind, because on the one hand, I'm like, oh, cool, like, this is actually part of it, but for the terms of dialogue and story exposition, I feel like you're making the jump, like you're restricted in a comic to a panel that won't move, so you can only put a few bits of information in each one, whereas in a movie, that's just not the case.
It's like there'll be people who are fans of the comic who really like that in this movie because it's very much like the comic. And then there'll be others where you're like, well, it's a different medium, so it doesn't translate necessarily well. With that, the way the movie is not necessarily edited super well, the pacing's not too great. While a lot of that is made up in a lot of fun monster mayhem, I feel it does undercut a lot of the cast's performances, because individually the performances were really good. I thought Ian McShane did a really good job. David Harbour, Daniel Day Kim, I thought they all did a really good job. But because of the way the movie was edited, the shared chemistry doesn't really get to shine, if that makes sense. Individually, I see you're committed. I know you guys are all great actors, and you guys are definitely delivering on what you're supposed to do. But because of the way the film is chopped together, their chemistry doesn't get to shine.
Yeah, it's like I liked everybody who was there. I could see all the potential, and just for whatever reason, a lot of things came out flat for me. The tone gets lost for me a lot in this movie, and that kind of hampers the character chemistry too. It leaves you with kind of not a lot to latch into, but a lot to kind of hope for. Like I like the idea of everybody, and I like what's being presented to me. I just wish it was in a different packaging, or it had a different finesse on top of it. It's like I would love to see this movie re-edited with the same people and the same elements, I
really feel like the main issue is the editing.
A huge issue is the editing.
Like there are like other issues, like this script could have been definitely fine-tuned, but I also feel like a lot of this script was sort of redone because of the way the movie's edited. I'm looking at all the images, I'm looking at everything that's on screen, I could feel the edit down, and I'm like, I bet there's a really, really just a movie that generally would have been perceived as really good if it had a different kind of cut. I really get that impression.
Yeah, and maybe if it lets some of the, again, I guess I harp on this a lot, but if it lets some character beats breathe or something, because the movie does start to get this cacophonous, very shrill pace going, where you're just kind of lurching from one event to the next, and like character motivations and things that should be pretty challenging, especially for Hellboy as a character. Certain internal struggles he's going through kind of feel random and start to feel sort of underserved and out of nowhere, and everything in the context starts to feel like a jumble. So like the action saves a lot, but the context is just kind of flavorless after a while. It's just kind of shrill and noisy.
I'll say I don't think it deserves a 12% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think while there's a lot of flaws in this movie, there's also a lot of really cool things in this movie. There's going to be some audience members where the really cool things will ultimately outweigh the flaws. I by no means think this is a flawless film.
I don't think anybody is going to 100% unironically and just enjoy this, but I did have a thought partway through the movie where I was thinking, I could see how you would really hate this. I can also see how you might have a blast watching.
Yeah, exactly.
Because like there are times when you're going to laugh on purpose, there are times when you're going to laugh for something maybe not on purpose, but sometimes that can help.
Like we said earlier, there's like CGI elements in here that just don't quite work. I liked it for the most part when it was used to enhance certain practical designs, but then there's also elements here where I'm just like, that just does not look very good. The times when I thought the CG worked, there's a character in here, Grugok, who's in the comic. I thought his design was really cool. I thought he was a more interesting villain than actually
Nimue. Well, it's like she really showed up for the role, but like Grugok is just so smart. He's got so much more interesting things to do.
He's a more compelling villain. His backstory is more interesting.
Yeah. He's got like an actual personal thing with Hellboy.
Like that's what I mean. The secondary villain is really interesting and even more menacing in some ways. He has a certain murder scene that's like really disturbing. Nimue is pretty much a generic villain. Mia Jovovich is doing her absolute best to elevate it.
It's
a mixed bag For me, I ultimately weigh in the direction of I enjoyed this and I don't think it's as bad as everyone made it out to be. I feel like if you unplug and just, release yourself to a fun B-movie monster mayhem romp, then I think you'll have a good time. But then I could also see why some people just really won't like it. Like you said, some people are going to hate this. Some people are going to have a total blast with this. I'm meeting people who are on both sides of those spectrums,
Yeah. And for me, I mean, ultimately, I fall in the middle. I think this movie is a mess in a lot of ways. But hey, some of that mess, like you said, is enjoyable. There are moments that did grab me and that did pull me in. And yeah, I think ultimately, if they just gave some breathing room to the cut, maybe added some things back in, this could have been much smoother.
All right, guys. Well, did you see Hellboy? What did you think of it? Do you agree with the critics? Are you more on that certified fresh audience score? Put it in the comments below. You guys can subscribe to the Reject Nation. Click that notification bell. We'll catch you guys soon.